Great. All right. Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Higher Business Series Inclusive Leadership and Smarter Decision Making, a conversation with Dr. Juliette Burke. Before we launch in, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm living and working today on the land of the Bundjalung people, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Kylie Ingram, the CEO and co founder of WISER. Today's guest, Dr. Juliette Burke, is special to us at WISER. Her research into leadership, diversity of thought, and decision making has directly influenced the foundations of our technology and, in particular, our decision power profiles. In today's conversation, we'll be digging into a big question for modern organizations. How should companies think about making smarter decisions? And what does inclusive leadership, why does that matter more than ever today? So if you have any questions today, just type them into the LinkedIn chat and we will get to them. Let me start by introducing Juliette. She's a global advisor to over 300 organizations, including the UN, Apple, BHP, Johnson & Johnson. She's the author of Which Two Heads Are Better Than One. She's a multiple award winner, including Top 100 Global HR Influencer, Deloitte Global Chairman's Award recipient, and AFR Top 100 Women of Influence. She has board roles with the Ovarian Cancer Council, Uni of New South Wales International Business Board, and Global Institute for Women's Leadership. She's a regular contributor for the Harvard Business Review and a TEDx speaker. Thank you for joining us today, Juliette. You must be very lazy with that, that background.
It sounds good, doesn't it? When it all comes together. I think it's just that when you've been around for a while, you just collect a lot of things along the way.
Very modest way of approaching it. So start by telling us a little bit about your background and what led you to focusing on decision making and leadership.
Well, I think it became part of it is that I started life as a lawyer and I realized I had a certain way of thinking about things only when I started working in a very different environment and I could see myself up against other people. That was when I was a partner in Deloitte, and it made me really curious about the different ways that people think. And so that set me off on a journey. But also I had been really interested in diversity, demographic diversity, so gender, LGBTIQ+, disability, age, for a long time. And I wondered if there was an intersection between the two.
Nice. And at WISER, we're huge fans, obviously, of your research of your book, Which Two Heads Are Better Than One. I think I even have a picture of it here somewhere I can pop up. There we are. It's a real gift, this book. It's so much more than your research. You look at research across the globe in this space, don't you? And I think, it's an amazing book for that, as well as what you discovered.
Yeah, no, thank you. I wanted to write a book that in some ways was the defining work of diversity of thinking, because I couldn't see anything in the market like that. And I was very intrigued by diversity of thinking because of my own experience. And so, yes, you're right, I did my own research on it. But this is a curation of global research, and it is published by the Australian Institute of Company Directors, which means that it had to be reviewed by expert authors as well to make sure that it was legitimate, credible, valuable. And one of those is Professor Scott Page, who I'm immensely in awe of, but also grateful that he took the time. And so it builds on work that he's done as well. And then I introduced some ideas into, our thinking, and then he built on my work after that. And then you've beautifully brought it together, which I'm very grateful for. But yes, the book looks at how we think about diversity in general, and looking at things like racial and cultural diversity and gender diversity, and it's looking at age diversity in there. And then I started thinking, well, is that how we understand how people think differently because they've got a different identity? And that led into a whole second tranche of research around thinking. And we can talk about that. And I love your phrase, decision power profiles. Is that what you called them? Yeah, I called them decision-making frameworks, but decision path profiles. And then I looked at inclusive leadership and how does inclusive leadership unlock those things. I just saw Katie O'Keefe pop up in the chat there, and she said, second edition. Yes, thanks, Katie. It is a second edition, actually, and we did update it, bring it up to speed again with a whole lot of new case studies. So I originally wrote the book in 2016, and then we did a second edition, which came out in 2021.
There's so much amazing stuff in there because, I just use it as a reference book as well so many times. When we first met, we were talking about that outward facing diversity, age, gender, and ethnicity when thinking about decisions in particular. Can we break that down a little and talk about how they play into better decisions? I really like the case study you give in the book about the jury, the juries, and how it, in some ways, it just slows down people getting to a decision so quickly.
Yeah, so let me I'll make myself a note so I bring in that Tufts study. So I guess one of the simplistic arguments around having diversity, demographic diversity, if I can call it that, in a decision-making group is that it will bring in people's different life experiences, and life experiences means you have a different perspective on something. And so I was really interrogating that. Is that true? Can we reliably say that if we had two people, and the Tufts study was about Black Americans and sort of more Caucasian Americans, so we can talk about that in a second, could we rely on that to say if we had two different people from two different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds or racial backgrounds, it would make a difference? Same argument in relation to gender. If we had a man and a woman next to each other, would that definitively say we would get two different perspectives? How that showed up in this Tufts study of the juries was that they had a jury who was, it's a fake jury in a way. It's a group of people put together in a criminal style situation where they're presented with a whole lot of evidence and they're asked to make a decision which has a lot of ambiguity into it, as did this person do this crime? And what they noticed was when they had, in this particular research, juries that were of one racial background, so let's just say they were all white, then they tended to make a decision that was, yes, it was a bit faster than the others, but also they made a decision which in the end was perceived to be more often than not wrong. They reached the wrong conclusion. But when they had juries that had a mix of racial backgrounds, slightly slower and not materially slower, but just a little bit slower. But there tend to be more questioning behaviours of people. There tended to be more listening to the other person's response. And so actually there was more probing of the evidence and therefore a better quality of discussion and actually a better outcome. So it was more consistent with what the evidence was saying, whereas when there was sort of a single racial group, they tended to speed through it a little bit more. And I think that's only natural in a way. We tend to assume what the other person's saying. Yeah, I know it. We don't really want to probe them too much because we see them as part of our tribe. And so I think it elucidates this really sophisticated but actually very real understanding of the benefits of racial, and I can talk about gender diversity in a second, but racial diversity in a group. It's not in and of itself that we can always say that person is going to bring a different perspective to the table. They might have a different lived experience. They may not. It may not be relevant to the question that we're asking. But we can say that it tends to generate different behaviours amongst people. So we tend to slow down just slightly the conversation. We tend to probe it a bit more. We tend to use racial diversity as a curiosity. It triggers us to think that maybe this person knows something that I don't know. So therefore, the quality of conversation the dynamics of the conversation are a lot better when you have racial diversity. So it does help you with diversity of thinking, but not in that linear way that you might think. Put two different people that come from two different racial backgrounds together, and they will inherently think differently. And
I know, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I guess I assumed it would just be that difference of experience, which does play a big thing, but it's the checking your bias at the door and acknowledging that difference of experience, isn't it? To some, is a large part of it.
It's that curiosity trigger that we have. And it's not just that study, the jury study, that they've done a number of different studies to prove that outcome, and not just in the black and white scenario, in other cultures as well. But we do tend to behave differently. And I'm not naive and say that we don't behave appallingly in some people's presence who have come from a different racial background. But at our best, it tends to be a positive contribution to the conversation. And of course, different lived experiences may be relevant sometimes to a decision, and we want to bring that in. But if the decision is about, something complex, shall we go into a new market that has nothing to do with someone's racial background, then actually that conversation doesn't arise. It's just about the quality of the thinking within the room. Do you want me to talk about gender as well?
Because that's what I was going to say. Let's talk about having women in the room, because that dynamic is not always what it seems to. I think one of the ones I loved was Enron, the Enron board example you gave as well.
Right. And Enron, and for Katie O'Keefe, this is Enron's in the new book as well. Enron was a very interesting example because actually it had a lot of racial diversity and gender diversity in the group, in the board, but it was still an underperforming board. And that one goes to the importance of an inclusive leader who is able to bring courage and curiosity and sort of interrogative thinking to the table. So you can have the right group, but you still need a good leader to bring that out. And the one around gender is interesting because, there's a lot of narrative in Western culture about, men and women being inherently different about the way they think about things. And really that essentializes men and women to a stereotype. Men are this, women are that. And yet, our own lived experience is that there's a broad range of ways of being if you're a man or a woman. And certainly if you take a bigger picture and you start to look across cultures, then the way that men and women embody whatever that masculinity and femininity is also very different. So what that means is gender is actually not very stable as a way of being. And so can we once again reliably say, if we had a man and a woman at the table asking this question, should we go into a new market, whatever the strategy is, should we develop this new product, should we, whatever it, you can't reliably say, well, that would make a difference to the way that they bring their point of view to the table. But it does make a difference in the way that the conversation flows, because the hidden difference between men and women is its impact on conversation. And if you see groups that are all women or groups that are all men, they tend to behave in a bit of a tribal way. You have this sort of inner circle of people who speak up, and then you have the people on the fringes, on the periphery. And those people on the fringes don't speak up because they don't want to disrupt the tribe. So you definitely don't get a full conversation going on in a single sex group. You might feel it if you're in the center of that group, but if you're on the fringes, you definitely don't. But if you have groups that are, and the number is 50-50, but it could be 60-40, what you have is fewer black spots. You have fewer gaps in the conversation, because when men and women come together, it breaks down the tribalism, and you have a more free-flowing conversation generally if it's 50-50. There's more psychological safety in the group, which is the tribalism that I was talking about. So less psychological safety we're talking business decisions here. We're not talking about personal conversations, business decisions. So there's less psychological safety in single sex groups sometimes, or a lot of the time. So it changes the conversational dynamic. It makes people feel more psychologically safe, but it also has this interesting effect on the behaviours of people in groups too. So not just the sort of speaking up, but people feel that the group is more cohesive when there is a group of people who are evenly balanced, and cohesion is also really important for the dynamics of a group. So once again, if I can just draw an underline underneath that, what it means is it actually is very important to have gender diverse groups, but not because of this simplistic answer that men and women will always bring a unique perspective based on that gender, but because we as humans perform better when there is a gender diverse group. And I want to be clear, I am just talking about gender diversity in male and female, because there actually hasn't been a lot of research that's been done on non-binary or other forms of gender identity. So I'm not bringing that into the conversation, not because I don't think about it, but because I just don't have enough evidence to have an informed point of view on the difference that might make.
And it, it'll be a difference in lived experience has always helped, doesn't it?
Well, it can, and that's
yeah.
Well, the more the merrier. Maybe I'm not sure about. Let me just go back to more the merrier, because I don't think it is the more the merrier. Actually, I think lived experience can be important if the question that you're wanting to debate requires that lived experience. So I do remember hearing a story about there was a company that was deciding, when frozen peas weren't a thing, should we develop frozen peas as a product? And there were no women in that conversation. It was only men. Well, in that conversation, you would think, actually, we do need women at the table as well, because men cook and women cook. And, given that dynamic, how would frozen peas fit into it? Well, because they didn't have any women at that table, and lived experience was relevant to that, then you would say, yeah, of course you need that. But sometimes the conversation is not about frozen peas. It's about something that really doesn't have a gender overtone to it. And so then the question is, do we still need men and women at the table? And my point of view would be, well, absolutely, you do need that. Now I crossed my fingers. Tell me why I crossed my fingers. There was something else I was going to tell you, but you remind me.
Well, also, it's funny that I even
the number.
The merrier, because
the more the merrier. Thank you.
We're going to get to that, because we don't even believe that ourselves. It's about the right people in the room, isn't it? And how you curate that.
It definitely is. And the answer to the more the merrier is, it's not that endless amounts of diversity create more and more value. Because actually what happens, and this is, a beautiful study that was done by Professor Scott Page, where he was modelling, if I have 3 different perspectives, 5 different perspectives, 9 different perspectives, is it endlessly increasing the value? And actually his research, he didn't model every set of numbers, and my set of numbers comes at 6. I think there are 6 different ways of thinking about problems. I know you and I have had discussion, maybe there's 7, but anyway, the number is not 9, because once you have 9, you actually have too much noise in the system. So we only have a finite amount of sort of brain capacity to take in these different perspectives. And after 9, and it's actually before 9, but we just don't know where, it's somewhere between 6 and 9, then it's noise. And so there is a defined amount of diversity that creates optimal value. You can have too little and then you don't get the value of it. You can have too much. And I don't think we've ever had that conversation around thinking diversity. You can have too much thinking diversity. It's just too much noise for us to absorb and make a decision.
Yeah, that's super interesting, which I think we can get into when we start to really talk into your frameworks that you found. But what about expertise? That's a critical pillar. And I guess people like Boeing might want to put some engineers back in the room when they're making decisions. Like, you do need, how do you get why is getting the expertise in the room so important?
Look, the expertise is No, it's hugely critical, and I think one of the mistakes that I talk about in the book that I made really early on was this idea, because there is this idea of collective intelligence, and there's lots of famous anecdotes around, you've got a pig at a fair and you're trying to guess the weight of the pig, and if you ask everyone who goes to the fair and then you average up their answers, you will get the weight of the pig. And so there's this idea of collective intelligence is the answer. But there's not a lot of expertise needed in guessing the weight of the pig because, weighing up things, I'll have a kilo of mince, is something that we do, regularly in our lives. But when you have something that requires expertise, you do need a high level of capability in the room. So as you say, someone, a doctor, a surgeon, I want someone who actually has gone to medical school. I just don't want a collection of people who are going to throw around their ideas as to what I'm going to need for brain surgery. And the mistake that I made early on was I was tasked by a client with developing a strategy around something, and I said, well, let's test out this idea of diversity of thinking, and we'll just bring people into the room who have, a range of different sort of lived experiences and see if we can develop the strategy from that. The strategy was terrible. It was because no one actually understood the sort of the expertise that sat. You needed to know how things worked in the real world, not just sort of shoot the breeze. So we actually had a room of people who were just, everyday individuals, and we were developing something that required more than that. So diversity of thinking to me has greatest value when you have a complex problem and you already have people in the room who have different expertise bases to contribute to that discussion. So I agree with you that we need expertise. What we don't need is clones of each other in that expertise setting. We need different kinds of expertise. So, cross-disciplinary expertise usually, but we do need, at a fundamental, you have to have capability to be even at the table. And then we look around the table and we think, and do we have cognitive diversity as well? And yes, we can talk about that. Yeah, we're going to talk about the quality of the conversation that you have, and we'll talk about inclusive leadership as a contributor to making sure that the conversation is
and that's a good time to pull out a bit, isn't it? Why does this matter? And where do leaders fall into most trouble with it all?
Okay, so why does it matter? So the sort of value proposition in the end, and this is the difference between edition 1 and edition 2, is that I was very crisp in edition 2 as to the value proposition. In edition 1, even though, beautifully written, 250 pages, footnoted to within an inch of its life, you had to sort of get to the last page to work out what the answer was. Well, edition 2, I brought the answer forward. And the value proposition is that if you have diversity of thinking, and you have an inclusive leader, we'll talk about that in a second, then you are going to reduce the error rate that is inherent in decision-making if you have a group of clones by about 30%. So if you have all the same kind of people giving their point of view on a topic, even though you might feel like it's a very robust conversation, the error rate's about 30%. And it's not just about reducing errors. So we get to, this is the right answer, which was sort of that jury trial. What is the right answer? But also you want to increase innovation in any business. As I say, should I go to market on this? Should we divest ourselves in this market? What is the best decision, most innovative decision for a company? And the difference there is about 20%. So you're reducing error rates by about 30%. You're increasing innovative capability by about 20%. And then the additional thing is when you have a group of people who embody this diversity of thinking, not only is the decision a better quality decision, but other people who are outside of that group look at the decision made by the group and think, I see my voice represented in that group in the way that they have thought about things. The way they're talking about it, I hear myself when they express that point of view. So you get higher levels of trust in the decision that's being made, as opposed to looking at it and people thinking, well, what would you know? And it's going to fail. So the value proposition is you get reduced risk, higher innovation, and more followership. So you don't have to relitigate things all of the time. And then the second part of that question was around inclusive leadership. And a couple of people on the call have worked long and hard with me on inclusive leadership, Dr. Tanya Nicholson, Katie O'Keefe. And what we developed there was a profile of what an inclusive leader does, the behaviours that they do to elicit the diverse thinking in the group. Because you can think of diversity of thinking as in some ways a latent capability. It's just going to sit there unless you have an inclusive leader who creates the conditions for it to come forward. And that inclusive leader, first of all, is very committed to the idea that there's diversity of thinking in the group, and I really want to bring it out. They're very humble in themselves, so they give space to other people to speak up. They create psychological safety. They're conscious of their biases. What do I bring to the table? What do I need to do to adjust so that everyone gets an opportunity to speak up? They're curious, so they're asking good questions. They're very empathetic. If there's cultural diversity in the group, they're also very attentive to that, and also they're very collaborative. So there's sort of six capabilities that are sitting there. But you absolutely need a highly inclusive leader to elicit the value, 30% reduction in risk, 20% increase in innovation, higher levels of trust in the ultimate decision from the inclusive leader.
Yes, we seem to be maybe inclusive leaders are not popular in this age. They should be more so. So what have you seen? I'll skip over that political bit. But what have you seen? What kind of outcomes do you see other than, when we talk about 30%, 20%, what can that look like? Because that sounds huge. Who wouldn't want to sign up for that? Like, you'd be insane not to sign up for that, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things with seeing it, right? Because I think it's often very hard to see that the decision wasn't as innovative as it could be, or it built in too much risk. But let me give you a couple of examples of that I found. And there's only a few of them in some ways because, as I say, it's hard to see. We sort of feel it a bit intuitively, but I can talk about a couple of examples that make sense. And one of them, and also people don't like to profile when they didn't make good decisions, so that's the other thing. But one of them, Peter Warne, who was the chair of Macquarie, I was talking to him about it, and because he was a big fan of the book as well, and he was talking to me about a decision that Macquarie made to do the Green Investment Bank in the UK. I don't know if you remember it, but anyway, very big decision to branch out into the UK. But actually, it took 12 months longer than it was supposed to take, and 12 months longer. So it built in risk, and the risk manifested itself in a delay in getting to market, which was costly for them. They rectified it, but 12 months out of market is a significant cost. And when he looked at it later through this lens of diversity of thinking, and he looked at those sort of 6 profiles that I've talked about, different ways that people think about things. I actually haven't gone into it in detail yet, we will. But he noticed that on the board, but also on the deal table, there was no one who brought a really strong people lens to the conversation. So they were experts in their own domain, but no one had expertise plus a people lens. And therefore, they didn't really pay attention to stakeholder engagement. And that's actually what was their downfall. So it wasn't the structure of the deal. Structure of the deal was brilliant, in terms of the evidence base for it, how they were going to measure those numbers, in terms of the outcomes that they were trying to achieve, the different options that they'd looked at, the risk profile, all of those things looked good, but they hadn't brought a people lens to it. And therefore the stakeholders, the community was not on board. So they had to reel it back in, work out that bit, and then go forward again. And another example is when McDonald's and Chipotle were trying to work together, trying to do a joint venture, and it didn't work. And when you look at that later and you think about what they both brought to the table, one of the organizations was, very relationship oriented. That was Chipotle, and had good relationships with its community. McDonald's is much more about process, and so there was a real difference between their cultures. But also, they didn't think about the deal through those combined lenses. And so it was only when the two cultures came together that they realized we think about our business in a very different way, and they weren't able to meld them together. So in the decision, should we do this merger, they didn't have diversity of thinking, and in the execution, it failed. And so eventually Chipotle and McDonald's separated again. And there were a lot of things that went wrong along that journey as well. There was an E. coli outbreak, for example.
Super interesting stuff. So let's get to the where your research ended up with your 6 mental models and frameworks that you outline. I'll let you outline them rather than go through them.
Okay. So this was, so first of all, let me say, when we were thinking about this and we were doing sort of original research on this, we were listening, and I in particular was listening to how people talk about things. And as I say, I'd had my own lived experience of once being a lawyer, coming into the environment of Deloitte, this, global multinational, and feeling that they thought very differently than I did about a problem. And I had this experience one particular day where we were doing a strategy workshop. The leader, good leader, and he had his flip chart, and he's drawing on it, and he's saying, well, these are the things that we could do over the next 12 months. And, we could do this, this, and this. So he had options on the table there on the flip chart. And then he did a consultative process with the group. What does everyone think? So he was bringing a bit of people into it. Do you think we could do this? Do you feel that we've got the capability? So let's say ticking off the people. So if I just run through these as a top line, first of all, he had a list of potential options on the table. He had a very clear outcome. We want to increase revenue over the next 12 months. He did a bit of a process involving people. And then he kind of stopped. And the stop for me was then he then said, okay, let's all make a decision. And I was looking at that and thinking, we have no evidence to make this decision. And as I said, I came from a legal background where evidence is key. You can't just turn up in court and say to the judge, it's the vibe, I think we should do this. You've got to prove your case. So it had been drilled into me, you've got to have evidence-based decision-making. So when he came around to me in the group and he said, what's your point of view on this? I said, I don't have a point of view yet because we're just sort of making this stuff up. And one of the other leaders who was listening to me said, you just can't make a decision. And I thought, no, I've sat on a legal tribunal. I know how to make decisions, but I make decisions on evidence. So it was the first experience that I'd had that actually these people think differently to me. And then, so I had the bones of some different ways of thinking about things, but I didn't know if that was right. And because I'm very evidence driven, I needed to explore that. And I started to then do a whole lot of surveys with my team to try and understand the different ways that people think about things. And as I say, I've identified a few of them for you. An outcomes focus, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What does success look like? Some optionality, what could we do? What are the alternatives? What's been done before? Some people as part of it. Do people have the capabilities? Do they have the motivation? Do we have the right culture? Evidence, I've just introduced. Do we have the base on which to make a decision? How would we even measure if we were being effective or not? And then there were 2 more that came out, one of which I'm not very good at, so it was hard for me to see initially, and that was process. How are we going to actually implement this decision? Do we have the resources? Do we have the budget? What are the stage gates for it? So that was a an eye-opener. And when we had those 5, I then started to do larger scale surveys, asking lots of people. And I asked them those questions. Do you perceive yourself to be more oriented towards this kind of decision or that kind of decision? And then I left a box at the end, which was, and if we haven't got it right, what's the way that you would make decisions? And from that, we discovered risk as an orientation as well. So some people like to have as their dominant frame what could go wrong and how might we mitigate those solutions. So yeah, thank you for putting that up. So it's not to say that we can't do all of these. Of course, we can all do them. But when you sit next to someone who's a master or a mistress in that particular frame, then after a couple of questions, you put your cards down, leave it to them. So if someone's very outcomes oriented, and I remember being in a conversation with someone who was very outcomes oriented. We had 30 minutes to make a decision about something as a group. He spent 25 of those minutes just talking about defining the outcomes. What is it that we want to achieve? So that's an outcomes oriented person. Whereas what you want to do is give equal time to each of these orientations. And although you might feel like I can have a conversation on this, if someone else can have a more in-depth, more robust conversation, then cede the floor to them. So you don't have to try to be the best at all of them. You can know the words, but diversity of thinking is about having a group where someone who is, if you're like me and you're more evidence-oriented, then if someone else is more risk-oriented, I cede the floor to them and I might speak up a bit more about being evidence-oriented. But if someone could be even more evidence-oriented than me, and therefore I might go to what is my secondary in that space, so being a bit more people-oriented. So this is about, what do I think is the most important question to ask in solving a problem, and how much depth do I have under that first question, and getting a group of people who are masters or mistresses in that way of thinking about things.
One of the really interesting things too is that you saw that leaders tend to end up a certain type, maybe outcome. You talk about it more, but what I found fascinating was that young people will change to what their leader. Am I defining that the right way? That they become more like whoever their leadership is above them, and that must cause that. Yeah. That's a problem, isn't it, long term?
Well, it is. I think if we think how hard it is to do demographic diversity, cognitive diversity is often difficult for us to see in ourselves. I mean, you can work it out, and all you have to do is ask other people, and they'll say, if you ask Tani and Katie on this call, what's Juliet like? I mean, they would have a pretty clear view of what I'm like, and no need to share it, folk. But other people can see us. Sometimes we can't see ourselves as clearly. That's part of it. But also, we as humans are very adaptable, and we adapt to the environment around us. And what I found, it was a sort of triangle in a number of organizations that I was looking at. And that was that as people entered the organization, there was much more greater diversity of thinking. Risk and evidence are always a little bit in the minority. It's never equally distributed at the bottom, but there was greater cognitive diversity. But as people went up the ladder, there were two things that were happening. One, you're right, Kylie, that leaders were selecting people who looked just like them. We all know about that mini-me bias, and that's what people do, not just in terms of demographic diversity, but also in the way that people think about things. And I told you there was the leader from the outside who said to me, oh, you just can't make a decision. So he didn't like the way I was thinking, and he was trying to put it, do a put down around it. But it's just I didn't think like him. Nothing wrong with my thinking. So leaders select people who look like them, so they'll pull them up to the top of the tree. But because we're adaptable as humans, we morph. And that's what I saw in this results. It was sort of, it was a little bit creepy in a way that as people progressed, they sort of shed that skin of what they could see wasn't being valued in their organization, and they became more like the leaders. And in particular, and I described that leader with the whiteboard, who was very outcomes and options oriented. At the top of the tree, 75% of leaders are outcomes and options oriented. And so they're choosing people and people are adapting, but what you get at the top of the tree then is conversations which are not fully exploring those 6 different ways of thinking about things, because it's harder to find them. And so the important part here is to nurture that capability coming up the tree, or if you don't have it at a senior group, to sort of import it from the outside. Or if you have someone in that group who has a secondary. So I said before that my secondary might be around people, that I'm sort of empathetic and conscious of a people orientation, stakeholder engagement, capabilities with people. Then, you're trying to bring that out as a secondary in me, So, Juliet, could you bring a sort of people orientation to this conversation? Because we obviously don't have it in the room at the moment as someone's primary. But yeah, it is sort of weird. And what I'm interested in is whether that holds true across different cultures, because I think I could probably guess in an American culture, Australia, probably New Zealand, UK, Canada, we're probably all of that similar mold, which is outcomes and options oriented at the top, because when you see deals across the world, you see that. But I think in some other cultures, they might be a bit different. And I know, Japan went through very much a process orientation, and so did Germany at one stage. So it could be in different cultures that who rises to the top is actually a different profile, but I don't know the answer. I'm just hunching.
It must be, how that plays out, and you're lucky you had that background of lawyer. You were confident enough in yourself when the guy goes, you can't think or whatever, but that must be, it must lead to things like, siloing and disengagement, which is what might appear as fear of retribution. So people silent, like it might feel better for him that he doesn't have to push up against anything, but at the end of the day, it leads to culture problems.
Yeah. And I remember speaking to this woman, because I did do, deep interviews with people as well. And she was the chief legal counsel of an organization. And so she happened to think in a very evidence way as well. Not all lawyers think in an evidence way, let's be clear, but she happened to. And she experienced the same thing, people pushing back on her perspective. And she said, I will be heard. And she's in a position where she can enforce that, right? She's the chief legal officer. So she had status and power. But you're right. People who don't end up sort of suppressing their thinking or not speaking. If they do speak up, it's very short. So they're not really elaborating on that thinking. And yes, I imagine that it would have an impact on people's interest in staying in that organization if that perspective is not appreciated. I think what people do is they morph into another way of being, and they sort of push that one to the side. But I do think it has unfortunate consequences for not only the quality of conversation in those groups, but also the employee experience of people who think differently. And I did find it very confronting when it happened to me. And I was in a position of power. I was a partner. And I was confident in myself. I knew that I could make decisions. So I knew this guy misunderstood what was going on. But I also found it very confronting to be called out like that. And I did find it alienating. I did see that I had a minority way of thinking. For me, that was in the end energizing, because I was curious about what was going on. But if someone wasn't in a position like that, I can see that it would be very hard for them.
Yeah, it's incredible. I think that, disengagement in the workplace is a $500 billion problem in the US alone. So
Right.
I think it's like $3,000 on every $10,000 of wage is lost with that disengagement or something, which is incredible. I think Gallup's study just came out last week and said the same thing.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at the composition of, once again, we don't need everybody in the room, but who do we need? What are some tips that you could give organizations for making sure they're, other than using Wiser?
Yeah. And I do think genuinely that Wiser is great. I'm super supportive of what you've done, because I think you've taken it to another level and very helpful for people to understand themselves and people to understand the people that work around them in a much more rigorous way. So kudos to you. But I think one of the things that I really liked, Mike Henry, who's now the CEO of BHP, I was talking to him about it, and he's also, I profiled him in the book, and he's a lovely man and very comes from a science background and, you know, very thoughtful. And he said, notwithstanding that he comes from a science background and you might have some ideas about how he's making decisions, then he also uses his body's response. And I think that's very interesting for us, right? We do have sometimes allergic reactions to other people when they're speaking up, and you just think, oh, enough already, you know, like we don't need another 5 minutes of your conversation. And sometimes I think we can ask ourselves, is that because they're actually giving us a different way of thinking? And I just don't like that. And he says that was true for him. And so what he would do is if someone was speaking from a process point of view, you know, how is this going to be done? Here's the Gantt chart. Let me walk you through it. He'd sort of find himself tapping his foot and sort of wanting to push himself away from the conversation. Well, if you're the leader in that group, everyone is highly attuned to your nonverbal cues. And he, in some ways, didn't realize that he was doing that, but also he thought he was trying to be positive. So for him, pushing himself away from the table was a signal, I'm ceding the table to you. You speak up, I'll lean back. But other people read it as, I'm checking out. So he says that, you know, having this visceral reaction to someone, you know, think of it as getting under your skin, can sometimes be a helpful cue where instead of pushing away from the table, actually physically lean in and ask the person, tell me more about that. So you really have to stay on top of the reaction that you're having and see it as a cue to actually exploration rather than disengagement of someone else's different perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It is hard to keep your emotions in check sometimes when it's rough going, especially when somebody is always has the floor. And what about organizations that find it hard to have that breadth of cognitive diversity or frameworks? What do you see there, or how can we help them?
So I think, and this was interesting. So one of the organizations we did some research for was Defence, and they gave us a really interesting task, which was to look at some decisions that had been made which were not optimally deployed, and what could they have done differently. So I think one of the things that an organization could do is do a reflective piece. If I look at this decision and looking at the words that are used, looking at how it's explained to people, then can I see that there was a gap in terms of one of those 6 frames? And actually that's what happened with the Defence. They looked back over it, we looked back over it, and we could see, you know what, you spent a lot of time talking about this, but you didn't spend a lot of time talking about that. So that's one strategy an organization could use. But it doesn't get to that point that you're raising, which is, what about if you don't have that diversity of thinking in the room? Well, I think one of the things you can do is, and I alluded to it previously, is that you can ask people to identify what is their primary and their secondary way of thinking about things. And then you sort of really elevate that secondary one. And if you do secondaries, you end up covering a lot more of the field. But I've done this exercise many times, and there can still be gaps in a group. And if there are gaps in the group, then a couple of things that you can do, if you're not wanting to sort of change the system to make sure that there's greater diversity of thinking coming in and being supported in the organization, is to see if you can import someone in who could bring that perspective to you. And it might be that they're part of that decision-making group. They've got to have other capabilities to be in at the table, but you might have to import them in, or you might have to go away and source that opinion and it will be brought into someone else. But to just ignore it is no answer, because you won't have as much innovation. You'll be taking the risk in. People won't follow that decision. So whatever it is, what I would say is, don't do the sort of pretend, where you say, how some groups are told, we're going to do a black hat exercise, which is basically a risk kind of exercise. Someone can be the black hat and can speak up about all the things that might go wrong in that scenario. Inauthentic behavior is never as valuable as authentic understanding, because that person doesn't really have a risk orientation and you're asking them to fake it. And so you won't get the real depth that you need. So I wouldn't say just have a go at it. I don't agree with that, and I don't think the research supports that. I would say you have to go out, and if you can't have that person as part of your decision making, at least go out and source a perspective deliberately. I don't think that we've really socialized this idea with someone who has a deep, in this example I'm using risk, has a real deep understanding of risk. Let's go and socialize it with someone who has that, or bring them into the conversation as the decision is being made.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, what you're saying there takes me to people when they do fake stakeholder engagement, and they bring in and they say, you play this role today or whatever. I just can't see how that can.
Yeah.
If we touch on just, building those right groups, does it also mean that people are going below the expected area of, executives or whatever, which can, you can find leaders that way, you can unearth talent. And I think that's part of, what we're so excited about your work is we are trying to unearth people that are overlooked. We are trying to show a process, a green light, you've got the right thing, a red light. Hey, be mindful that you might not have the people to give you these answers.
Yeah, and I do think that's why you need an inclusive leader once again, because some of the original research that was done around inclusive leadership was trying to rebalance power differences, particularly between doctors and nurses. That's because what was happening was that nurses were seeing a whole lot of risk in an environment, but because of the hierarchy, they wouldn't speak up, and there wasn't psychological safety there. That's Professor Amy Edmondson's work. So you do need a leader who is going to equalize that power imbalance. If you've got to go down through the food chain to find someone else with a different perspective, then they're going to walk into a group of senior leaders and potentially find it hard to speak up, even though they've been given a seat at the table for it. So I do think there's something about an inclusive leader helping that to happen, and articulating, as I said before, inclusive leadership. One of the first things I said is an inclusive leader has to really believe in it, be committed to it. And part of that is about verbalizing, we need a diverse thinking group to help us get to the best answer. And we have some great people at the table here today. But as you know, we're not really good on name the perspective, whatever it is. We're not very good on process. So today I invited this person to the group to help us think that through in a different way. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we're coming up to the hour. What are you working on now? What's next for you? You've got your own podcast. You've got all sorts of things.
Podcast, which is great. So I get to interview amazing people. It's such a privilege. For an hour, I get to just probe them and just ask curious questions, and I learn so much. So I love doing that. That's the business of. And then I'm writing a new book, which is really exciting, and I'm learning a lot through that experience as well. As you said, I chair Ovarian Cancer Australia. I'm the chair of the Parliamentary Advisory Group on bullying, sexual harassment and serious misconduct in New South Wales Parliament. So, there's lots of, I have a great life. Oh, and I started learning pottery. And so I also have a life outside of work.
Very lovely. Well, Juliet, thank you so much for joining us today. Your work continues to shape what good leadership should look like and how organisations can think more clearly and make more inclusive decisions. And thank you for everybody that tuned in and being part of the Higher Business series. If you'd like to learn more about Juliet's work, we'll share links in the comments. And if you're curious about how decision-making science can be applied to your organisation, reach out. Thank you so much for your time, Juliet. I feel the privilege of spending an hour with you and picking your brain.
Oh, thanks, Kylie. I really do like what you've done. There's very few organisations that I really put myself behind. As you imagine, quite a rigorous kind of process. And when I saw what you've done, I was super impressed by it. And then having been a bit part of this exploratory journey that you've gone on, kudos to you. Really, really well done.
I think it's not often when you're saying to somebody, "Oh, can I use your, PhD?" And I can't explain enough to people how kind and generous you've been, and how you've been out there in the thought of let my research live in the world as well. So, it's incredible. It's an incredible privilege to work with you. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.